I signed the lease because the price felt like mercy. 2 weeks later, I understood what it really was: a discount for living close enough to inhale whatever leaked from the wrong house when the wind shifted. If I hadn't done what the curandera told me to do, if I hadn't paid the fee she demanded from my own body, something would have crossed the line of my yard, and I would have been found at dawn, the way the little animals were found. At first, I tried to keep it simple. Old rentals smell, stray cats scratch glass, exhaustion turns shadows into threats. I moved into the place at the end of the dry season, when the hills around the village looked scraped raw, and the dirt road dusted every doorstep pale. I worked at a small depot outside town, loading trucks until my arms went numb. I wasn't running from anyone. I wasn't chasing a dream. I just needed a room where I could sleep without owing favors. The rental was one main room, a tiny kitchen corner, a bathroom that always carried a faint bite of bleach. The landlord, Arturo, walked me through quickly, pointing at the water tap and the breaker like he wanted the business finished before the sun dropped. When I asked about the house next door, he didn't answer right away. "That's Dua Elvira," he said at last. "She owns this row. She stays to herself. You do the same." I saw her while I carried my mattress inside. She sat on a low chair just inside her open doorway, not truly inside, and not truly outside either. Her hair was long, mostly white, tied back in a way that looked more like restraint than grooming. What caught me wasn't her age, it was her focus. Her eyes didn't wander. They fixed on me with a patience that made me feel measured. Cats moved around her feet like smoke, not 2 or 3, the kind you tolerate in rural places, but many, slipping through the narrow gap of her door without rubbing against her legs, without a sound. They climbed the short wall between our yards with the balance of something built for watching. I nodded a greeting. She didn't nod back. She didn't smile. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers curled as if she held an invisible thread and could tighten it whenever she wished. That first night, the strange thing was not a noise. It was the air. A heavy odor crawled in from the wall I shared with her house, thick and stale, like wet soil left in a bucket too long. I sniffed my kitchen, checked the drain, lifted the trash bag. Nothing. The smell was simply there, pressing into my nostrils. I opened the window. The village was quiet, a few dogs barking far off, a motorcycle fading down the road. For a moment the odor thinned. Then it returned, not carried on the breeze, but blooming from inside the plaster, as if the wall itself exhaled. Mold, I told myself. Old pipes. I said it out loud because silence makes bad ideas grow. The next night the odor arrived before dark and clung to my throat. When I turned off the light, footsteps moved on the other side of the adjoining wall, slow, weighted steps that crossed, paused, crossed again, as if someone had stopped to listen back through the plaster. Then came a dry knock, not on a door but on the wall itself. 3 measured taps evenly spaced, like someone testing thickness. I sat up, holding my breath. No voices, no laughter, only a long silence, and underneath it, a faint dragging sound as if something soft had been pulled across concrete. I told myself the old woman was moving furniture. I told myself she had a cane. I told myself anything except the truth my skin was already reading. The taps had intent. In the morning, the cats were in my yard. One sat under the shade of my water bucket, tail wrapped neatly around its paws. It didn't flinch when I stepped outside. When I clapped my hands, it stood and walked to the wall between the yards, then stared down at the seam where the wall met the ground, like it expected that seam to open. 2 more appeared before I left for work, slipping from behind my laundry line and settling in a row in front of my door. They didn't fight. They didn't meow. They just watched, quiet as judges. That afternoon I found 3 scratches on my window, pale lines that caught the light when I moved my head, clean, parallel. They started and ended at the same height, right where a person's chest would be if they stood outside and leaned in. I wanted to blame the cats. I wanted to blame a branch. I wanted a reason that didn't involve a hand choosing that exact spot. That night, just before dawn, I heard it, the faintest scrape on glass, slow and deliberate, like a nail being drawn lightly over a plate. It lasted a second, but it cut through me. I sat up and stared at the window, seeing only the reflection of my own face. When daylight returned, I went to wash the glass. My hand stopped halfway. Pressed into the dust on the outside was a full handprint, fingers spread, the heel of the palm dark, as if someone had leaned their weight into the window and held it there. The fingertips were too long to belong to a normal gesture. If you ever feel like a house is watching you back, don't argue with your instincts. The walls don't need eyes to learn your habits. The next week taught me how quickly a small fear can become a schedule. I started coming home earlier, not because I liked the place, but because I hated arriving after dark. I began locking the door the moment I stepped inside. I checked the latch twice, then a third time, because the third time is when you notice your hand is shaking. The odor didn't fade. It changed. Some evenings it was sour and wet. Other nights it was dry and dusty, like old hair burned on a stove. It clung to my curtains and followed me into the shower. Ventilation didn't help. The smell didn't leave through the window as much as it seemed to wait outside until I closed it again. On the fourth night the knocks returned, but not from the wall. They came from the outside of my front door, low, near the base, as if someone had tapped with fingernails instead of knuckles. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again. Patient, not frantic. I stood with my ear inches from the wood, breathing through my mouth so I wouldn't cough. I pictured a child playing a prank. I pictured a cat scraping the door frame. I pictured anything except the other possibility that the tapping was an announcement. When I finally flipped on the porch light and opened the peephole cover, there was no one on the step, but on the door itself, near the latch, I saw fresh lines in the paint. 3 shallow grooves, perfectly parallel, the same height as the window scratches. That was when the fear stopped being only in my head. It became a mark I could touch. I tried to fix it the way a rational man fixes problems. I bought tape and sealed the edges of the windows. I hammered a thin strip of wood into the gap under the door. I placed a chair under the doorknob like I'd seen in movies, and felt foolish the moment I did it. The next morning the chair stood in the middle of the room as if someone had carried it there and set it down carefully. No noise had woken me. The door was still locked. The tape was intact. I told myself I must have moved it in my sleep. The lie tasted like metal. The cats multiplied. They began gathering before sundown, not only at my door but along the short wall and on the roof edge. When I stepped outside, they didn't scatter like strays normally do. They flowed away a few feet, then stopped and turned to look back, as if I were the intruder and they were allowing me a small corridor through their territory. One evening, when the air was still and the dust hung low, I glanced toward Elvira's doorway. She wasn't seated. She stood in the shadow inside her house, shoulders squared, posture straight in a way that didn't match her age. She looked taller than she had on moving day, as if her body remembered a different shape. I froze with my key in my hand. She lifted her chin, just slightly. No smile, no greeting, only that steady focus like a lens tightening. I hurried inside and locked the door so hard the latch snapped. That night the scratching came from the wall itself, not the window. A long, thin scrape traveled across the plaster outside, moving slowly from left to right, as if someone was drawing lines across my house to measure it. The sound did not hurry. It did not stop when I held my breath. It continued until it reached the corner, then faded, as if the thing doing it had simply walked away. In the morning I found the marks, pale grooves in the stucco, 3 of them parallel, the same height again. The plaster had chipped in tiny curls, like dry skin peeled from a wound. A quote I'd heard in the depot from an old driver drifted into my mind. Some people don't curse you with words, they curse you with routine. I understood it then. 2 nights later the yard proved how little my locks meant. I had double-checked every latch before bed. I had wedged the gate with a brick. I had left a bucket upside down against it so it would clatter if the gate moved. Near dawn, I woke to a soft rustle on dirt-tiny footfalls, many of them circling. I got up and peeked through a tear in my curtain. A cat sat in the middle of my yard, motionless, facing the shared wall. Another walked along the base of the wall as if tracking a scent. A third perched on my windowsill, its body blocking the moonlight. The gate was still wedged. The bucket had not moved. I opened my mouth to shout, and nothing came out. The cat on the sill turned its head slowly, and for a moment the reflective shine of its eyes looked like something else. like a face peering from a crack. Then it jumped down without a sound and padded toward the door, stopping precisely at the threshold, staring at the wood as if it could see through it. When morning came, I found paw prints on my roof, a thin trail of dusty ovals that led directly above my bed. They ended there, clustered in a tight group, as if the animals had gathered to listen to me breathe. That evening I found the first gift. It was not a whole rat or a bird, the way cats sometimes leave offerings. It was pieces, a small spine, a torn patch of fur, a wet scrap of something that might have been a heart. The pieces were arranged on my step, not scattered. No blood trail, no struggle marks. Placement. My stomach turned. I backed away like the pieces were alive. Across the wall, Elvira's door was half open. The interior was too dark to see into, but I felt her presence, the way you feel heat from a stove. You can't see, and my skin prickled along my arms. That night she came to the window. I heard slow steps on my porch, heavier than a cat, lighter than a man in boots. The steps stopped. I kept the lights off and crept toward the curtain, lifting it an inch. She stood so close her breath fogged the glass. Straight-backed, shoulders level, head tilted as if she were listening to the inside of my skull. Her hands rested flat against the window, fingers splayed. I saw the nails then, longer than I had imagined, thick and stained, curved slightly like hooks. She raised her face until her eyes met mine through the thin gap in the curtain. Then she smiled. It wasn't an expressive smile. It didn't grow or soften. It arrived fully formed and stayed, a mask stretched across skin. She held it there, unblinking, as if the smile was not emotion but instruction. Her nails touched the glass. The sound was a long, aching screech that made my teeth hurt. She drew 3 lines slowly, carefully, over the old scratches, deepening them. When she finished, she didn't try the latch. She didn't pound the frame. She simply kept smiling as if she'd completed a simple chore, then lowered her hands and walked back toward her house with the calm of someone returning from the market. I stayed behind the curtain until dawn, afraid that if I moved she would somehow know. In the morning, the new scratches gleamed. When I leaned in close, I caught a faint metallic scent, sharp and unmistakable. The grooves smelled like blood. Some threats don't say they'll hurt you. They show you that they can touch you without entering. By the second week, my body stopped waiting for sleep. It waited for night. At work, I moved crates like a machine and nodded at jokes I didn't hear. My thoughts lived ahead of me, always 10 hours into the future, always in the dark. The odor now seeped into my clothes. Men at the depot wrinkled their noses when I passed. One asked if I'd been cleaning a septic tank. I laughed too loudly and said the plumbing in my rental was cursed. The kind of joke people accept because it keeps things light inside. My stomach tightened. The smell wasn't in the plumbing. The smell was in the wall. The scratches spread, not more chaotic, more deliberate. They appeared on the doorframe, on the kitchen window, on the plaster outside, where no cat could reach without climbing, like a human, always the same height, always parallel, always 3, sometimes 6, as if someone had traced them twice. I began noticing other changes, small enough to doubt but too consistent to ignore. A spoon left on the counter would be turned bowl side down in the morning. The dish towel would be folded into a tight rectangle instead of tossed over the chair. Once, I found my boots lined up heel to toe, pointing toward the shared wall, as if they were being taught where to walk. I told myself I was doing it without remembering. I told myself exhaustion had made me forget my own hands. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. Something was rehearsing me, moving my things to show me who held the space. One afternoon I came home early and found a cat inside my house. The door was still locked. The window screens were intact. Yet the cat sat on my floor near the shared wall, staring at it as if listening. When it heard me, it didn't bolt. It stood, walked toward the back door, and slipped through a gap that wasn't there at least. None I could find. I checked every corner on my knees with a flashlight. No holes, no loose boards, nothing. That was the day I stopped believing I could solve it with hardware. That night the scratching moved to the roof. At first it was a light scuttle, then a slow drag like nails pulled across tin. It traveled above my bed and stopped. I lay rigid, eyes wide, feeling as if something was directly over my face, separated from me by a thin layer of ceiling. The smell thickened until I felt it in my tongue. Then, softly, came the taps again, 3 of them. This time they came from above, from the roof, like someone knocking on a coffin lid from the outside. I pressed my palms to my ears and stared into the dark. A line formed in my mind, cold and clean. This is not haunting. This is claiming. I didn't know where the thought came from, but it fit too well. In the morning, I found new marks on the outer wall, long parallel grooves that ran almost the length of the room. Someone or something had traced the boundary of my house like a finger outlining a prize. That night, Elvira returned, but she didn't come to the window. She stood at the edge of my yard where the dirt changed texture, where Arturo had told me the property line was. She faced my house and lifted her hands slightly, palms open, as if feeling the air. For the first time, she didn't smile. Her mouth was a tight line. Her eyes moved over my walls like someone reading. I watched from the dark, unable to look away. She took one step forward and stopped, as if she had bumped into an invisible pain. Her fingers flexed. She leaned in, tested the air, then withdrew, slow and controlled. She turned and walked back into her darkness. I exhaled too hard and almost cried with relief. The relief lasted until morning, when I found 3 fresh scratches on the inside of my window glass, carved from my side outward. No cat could do that. No wind could do that. Only something already allowed in. At that point, logic became another form of denial. I could either keep pretending the rules of my world were intact, or I could admit that the rules had changed, and I was the only one still acting surprised. People nearby avoided details, but one name kept surfacing when I asked carefully: Rosa Calderon. People in small places don't advertise what they know. They hint. They trade names in the same tone they use for illegal work or family scandals. When I asked a neighbor where I could find someone who dealt with bad energies, he stared at the road for a long moment, then scribbled an address on a scrap of cardboard and pushed it toward me without meeting my eyes. Rosa Calderon, he said. If she turns you away, you go home and pray. Don't get angry. Anger feeds things. Rosa lived on a quiet street at the edge of town, in a low house with a clean yard and no symbols hanging from the door. That plainness made me trust her more than any wall of candles would have. She opened the door before I knocked, as if she had been listening for my steps. She was older than me, but not old. Hair pinned back, hands strong, eyes steady. She looked at my face once and stepped aside. "Come in," she said. Not a question, a decision. I sat at a small table. The house smelled of herbs and soap, not incense. When I spoke, the story came out like something I'd been holding in my lungs. The odor, the taps, the cats, the scratches. Elvira's smile at the window. Rosa didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she asked only what mattered. "Where do the scratches start?" she said. "Chest height." I answered, surprised by how automatic the measurement was now. Always 3. Always. "Does she ever step into your yard?" "Only up to the line." "Good," Rosa said, and the word did not sound comforting. It sounded like a doctor saying the tumor hadn't spread yet. She set a glass of water in front of me. The surface trembled slightly, though the room was still. "The problem isn't your house," she said. "It's what was invited in hers. And it's trying to borrow your space. Cats are easy for it. Smell is easy. Sound is easy. Your fear is easiest." I swallowed. "So what do I do?" "You draw your own line," Rosa said. "Not with chalk, not with paint, with ownership." She told me what to buy: coarse salt, limes, a bottle of clear alcohol, dried rosemary, a small pouch of red earth from the market, and a length of thin twine. Ordinary things, the kind you can carry without anyone asking questions. She gave me instructions with the precision of a recipe, and as she spoke, my mind latched onto the clarity the way a drowning man grabs a rope. "You'll mix them," she said. "You'll place them where your house breathes, corners, door, windows, especially the wall you share, and you'll do it before dark." I nodded. "That's it." Rosa's gaze held mine. "Number, that's the fence. But fences don't work unless the land recognizes you." She took a small needle from a drawer and set it on the table. "The last step requires a little blood. Yours." My stomach dropped. "Why?" "Because the line has to know who it's protecting," she said, voice flat. "If you want a door to stay closed, it needs a name. Blood is a name. The other side can't pretend not to read." I stared at the needle, then at my hands. I thought about the smell that had lived in my walls. I thought about the scratches on the inside of my glass. I thought about waking to taps on my roof. "A drop," Rosa said. "Not to harm you, to sign." She leaned forward slightly and listened to me carefully. "You do not threaten her. You do not go to her house. You do not ask why. You do your work. You stay calm, and you do not look through the curtain once you begin. Curiosity is another kind of invitation." On the way home, the bag of supplies felt too light to matter and too heavy to ignore. Every cat I saw on the sidewalk looked like one of Elvira's. Back at my rental, I worked before the sun dropped. I boiled rosemary and lime peel and let the steam fill the room until the odor retreated to a sour edge. I mixed salt and red earth and placed small lines under each window, then tied the twine in a loop and set it above the doorframe like a quiet boundary. When the final mixture was ready, I held the needle between my fingers. My hands were steady from fear, the way they get steady when there's no room left to hesitate. I pricked my fingertip. A bead of blood welled up, bright, real. I let it fall into the mixture. The drop disappeared instantly, swallowed like thirst. That was the moment the air changed. Not clean, not friendly, different, as if the house had been holding its breath and finally let it out. Night arrived without the usual parade of cats. The yard stayed empty. The taps didn't come. The roof stayed silent. I sat in the dark, refusing to trust it. Silence can be mercy, but it can also be a trap. Near midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow, controlled. They stopped at the edge of my yard. I lifted the curtain a finger's width and saw Elvira. She stood at the line, body straight, hands at her sides. She scanned my house with a tight, angry focus, like a person counting locked windows. She lifted her hands, palms forward, and held them there as if pressing against invisible glass. Her mouth did not smile. She stayed like that for a long time, longer than any human would, unmoving. Then, very slowly, she lowered her hands and turned away. She walked back to her doorway and disappeared into the dark. I waited for the cats. None came. I waited for the scratching. It never arrived. At dawn, I stepped outside, half expecting the yard to be full of dead things. It was empty. The air smelled like dust and morning, ordinary and sharp. Elvira's door was closed completely. Not even a crack, I thought, for the first time in days, that I might actually survive. Then I looked at my fingertip. The tiny puncture had clotted, but just above it, on the soft skin of my knuckle, 3 pale lines had appeared, parallel and clean, as if a nail had traced them while I slept. Something had read my signature. Days passed, and with each day the absence became its own kind of noise. I slept through the night and woke confused, as if my body didn't know what to do with rest. The odor faded from my curtains. The walls stopped feeling damp. I moved through the room without anticipating a sound behind every shift of air. Elvira's house stayed shut. No cats crossed the wall. No paw prints appeared on my roof. The shared boundary looked like any other line of plaster and dirt, harmless to anyone who hadn't lived inside its shadow. I asked around carefully. People shrugged. Some said she was visiting relatives. Others said, without saying much, that it was better not to wonder. The village has a way of burying what it can't file properly. It doesn't call it denial. It calls it peace. I didn't go back to Rosa. For a while I considered moving anyway. Safety can feel fragile once you've watched it get negotiated at your own window. I walked the little yard in daylight, tracing the line I believed I'd drawn, testing my courage by standing where she had stopped. Nothing pushed back. No cold air, no pressure, only sun on my neck and dust under my shoes. Still, I kept catching myself listening for taps that weren't there, the way an injured man keeps protecting a healed rib. One Sunday I passed Elvira's place on my way to the store and forced myself to look directly. Weeds had begun to climb the base of her door. The gap where cats used to slip through was sealed. No bowls of food, no movement behind the curtains. The house looked less abandoned than erased, as if someone had edited out of the neighborhood and left only the outline. I walked on without slowing, because some questions are just doors with better vocabulary. I repaired what I could. I replaced one pane of glass where the scratches were deepest, but I left the kitchen window untouched. The 3 lines there were still visible when the afternoon sun hit them. I told myself it was a reminder to be careful. The truth was harsher. It was evidence that I hadn't imagined my own terror. One evening, weeks later, the wind shifted and came from the direction of Elvira's house. With it came the faintest trace of that original odor, like a memory dragged back by a scent. I stood still, holding my breath, waiting for my body to decide whether to panic. Nothing happened. No taps, no scratching. I almost laughed at myself. Then I noticed the cats. Not Elvira's, not in a row, not watching. Just one, sitting across the road near a ditch, staring in my direction. It blinked slowly, then lowered its head and began cleaning its paw as if I were not important. I went inside and told myself the smell had been a trick of the wind. I cooked dinner. I washed my plate. I tried to live like a normal person again. Near midnight, I heard a soft sound on the outside wall, one long scrape that stopped abruptly, as if someone had dragged a nail and then lifted it at the last second. My stomach tightened, old fear returning like a reflex. I crept to the kitchen window, the one I had not replaced, and leaned close. In the moonlight I could see it, a new scratch, fresh and pale, laid beside the older ones. The line was so clean, it looked like it had been drawn with a blade. On the other side of the wall, Elvira's house remained dark and sealed. No light under the door, no movement. I backed away, heart thudding. And then, right beside my ear, so close, I felt the breath that carried it. A woman's voice whispered with the dryness of old leaves, "Don't ever give blood a second time." I turned and found myself alone.